My name is Elliot Parker. I'm a professor of economics in the University of Nevada, Reno. I'm also chair-elect of the Faculty Senate.
In an interview, you said Nevada's higher education system gets a larger portion of its budget from the state, but that does not mean it spends more to educate its students. As a share of state GDP, Nevada has the smallest general fund in the country. Nevada is also 50th in the country in higher education spending as a share of state income, 50th in the country in the number of its higher education employees as a share of population, and at the bottom of the number of students who attend college and below the national average in the higher education spending per student. So from stating this quote, how did Nevada's higher education come to be this way?
Well, let me first reinterpret that quote, and then I'll try to answer your question on how it came to be this way. One way I tried to phrase that, which many people found resonated for them, is I said a poor man spends a larger portion of his income on food, but that doesn't mean he eats better. The idea is, the governor was arguing that Nevada is relatively generous to higher education. And that's because if you look at how much Nevada spends as a percentage of our overall economy, we actually have the smallest general fund in the entire country. And in fact, we have a general fund, which is the monies that the legislature has to spend. We have the smallest general fund by about half relative to the national average. So we spend so very little on anything that his argument was, well, we're spending a large proportion of that small amount on higher education, but they're not actually spending more on higher education than other states are. Now, Nevada has, used to have, anyways, a much better K through 12 system, though the university has been growing up and improving over time. And part of that is spending, and part of that is other issues that are related to policies and reforms, etc. How did Nevada get in a situation where we're 50th? I would say there's really two reasons. One is that Nevada has, for many years, attracted people who tend to be relatively libertarian and anti-government. So there's a distrust of government that comes out of living in the frontier. And we've been this way in many cases. Look at our relatively liberal laws on casinos and prostitution and drinking and all the rest. We typically have that kind of attitude, and that's part of it, is that we don't really want to pay taxes, and when we do charge taxes we want others to pay for them. So we typically like to charge taxes on tourists who come here rather than Nevadans who live here. But the other thing is I think it's hard for most people to realize how fast Nevada has grown, and that what might have been an adequate level of spending 20 or 30 years ago is no longer an adequate level of spending when our population doubles or triples. And so part of it is just that we've been one of the fastest growing states, in fact the fastest growing state for many years, and our increase in public education spending has in no way come close to catching up with that.
Okay, so how will these deep cuts affect Nevada's economy later?
Well, I'm a believer that the legislature is trying very hard not to let the train go off the cliff. And we'll see what happens in the next month, but I believe there are some reasonable people who care about Nevada down in Carson City, and they're trying to find the best way they can to stop this catastrophe from happening. They recognize that it would be a catastrophe to do what the governor suggested to higher education, but they also want to get reelected. And so they're trying to find a way to do this without costing them too many votes, and there's real concerns about that. So let's just suppose that the governor's budget did go into effect, and the governor, as you know, decided to put most of the cuts and expenditures on the back of higher education in the mistaken belief that higher education could come up with the money to cover much of that shortfall that other agencies couldn't. And I argued in something I wrote that that's a profound misunderstanding of how the university budgets work. But let's suppose that happens. It means basically we're going to have to shut down much of what we do at the university. We've already cut many of the administrative functions that we can. We can't find more administration or fat to cut. We've cut virtually everything we can without cutting programs. So what would happen? Well, I think it would be harder for Nevadans to get into school. It would be harder for us to become the kind of university that smart students want to go to. You might think of us as sort of the University of Nevada, Reno Community College, if that's where we go to. So, the long-term effects of that is people aren't going to be moving here to relocate new businesses. They might move here to retire, but they're not going to want to pay taxes for anything when they come here to retire using money they earned in another state. But they're not going to move businesses here because they can't get an educated workforce. And they're not going to be able to have a good place to put their kids in school. So would you move to another state that had really terrible schools that were terribly underfunded? So, it's a downward spiral. We've attracted people because we were growing and there were many jobs in casinos and elsewhere. But now we're finding that we don't have the public infrastructure to continue to support that growth. And so I'm deeply skeptical that we'd be able to maintain anything like strong economic growth if we can't maintain a strong educational system and a good university.
All right. Okay, so we've heard numbers ranging from 100% to 300% for possible tuition increase. So could you interpret these numbers?
Yeah.
What they mean?
Of the budget that, what we call the operating budget that the university has to spend on the main campus, let's ignore things like the med school, which has its own separate budget. What we find is that students, when you add up your tuition and fees, students pay for roughly about 1/5 of the operating budget, and the rest of it comes from the state of Nevada. So the governor was talking about cutting something like $76 million out of our total operating budget, and the last time I looked it was something close to $280 million. Now, once we subtract out the amount students pay and we look at what the government would be supporting, we see that that's a recommended cut of something like 50% of the state government's contribution to the university budget. And it's about 36% of the total operating budget. So when you look at that and you say, well, could we fill that hole with student tuition increases? Well, technically we could, with a couple caveats. One is the amount of the gap is significantly more than students currently pay in. So students would have to dramatically increase the amount of tuition they pay in order to fill the gap that the governor does not want to fund. But that also assumes that students wouldn't leave. What we find, of course, is that most of us think that if we were to double tuition or triple tuition, that we would find an awful lot of students would find it very difficult to continue to go to school here. They would either go elsewhere or they would simply not go to school anymore. So it's not realistic to do that. It's also not realistic given that Nevada is at the very bottom in the number of students who go to higher education. President Glick likes to cite a source that Nevada is 50th in the country in the chances that a 19-year-old will be in college. So how you measure the rates depends on how many 19-year-olds there are as a percentage of the population, but the probability that a given 19-year-old, how old are you?
18.
18, okay, so next year you're in that group. The probability that you're at the university in Nevada is lower than in any other state.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not something we want to make even worse. What we'd like to do is get out of the bottom. We'd like to start having more of our students get an education. So it's not realistic that this is going to happen. What's more likely to happen, off the top of my head, is something much more reasonable, something in the neighborhood of 10, 15, 20, 25% increases. And there may be a couple over several years, but it won't be anything quite as dramatic as the numbers that would tuition would have to be raised in order to fill the entire gap. What we're going to do instead is we're going to wind up having to shut down an awful lot of programs. And estimates that President Glick put together suggested that it would cost us something in the order of 100, 120 faculty positions. And when you put together the number of students that those professors teach, that would cost us something like 15%, maybe even 20% of our total number of class offerings, and we'd have to reduce our student populations as well because we don't have large enough classrooms to teach all our students with fewer teachers.
Mm-hmm.